The title of today's story is The Talking Doll, so let's start the story. It was a chilly evening when Anya exploring her grandmother's attic. Anya loved exploring the large old house where her grandmother had lived for as long as she could remember. The attic was filled with forgotten treasures, antique furniture, faded photographs, and boxes of knickknacks. While rummaging through a particularly dusty trunk, she discovered the doll. The doll had wide, glassy eyes, dark curls, and a red dress that was now faded and torn. Despite its worn appearance, Anya felt a strange attraction to it. She brought the doll down to her room, not knowing the horror it would bring. That night, as Anya was drifting to sleep, she heard a faint whisper. She sat up, her heart pounding, and looked around the dark room. There was nothing but shadows and silence. She shook her head, thinking she imagined it, and went back to sleep. The next day, Anya placed the doll on a shelf in her room. As she was doing her homework, she heard it again, a soft, eerie whisper. She turned to see the doll's eyes staring straight at her. She walked over and picked up the doll, examining it closely. "Did you say something?" she asked, feeling foolish. The doll remained silent. That night, the whispers grew louder. "Anya, Anya." She bolted upright in bed, her skin crawling. The voice was clear now. It was coming from the doll. She grabbed the doll and threw it into her closet, slamming the door shut. But the whispers continued, seeping through the wooden door. The next morning, Anya told her parents about the talking doll, but they just laughed and told her it was her imagination. Determined to prove she wasn't crazy, Anya set up a camera in her room, aiming it at the doll. As darkness fell, the whispers began again. "Anya, come play with me." The voice was chilling, like icy fingers crawling down her spine. She watched as the doll's head slowly turned to face the camera. Terrified, Anya stayed awake all night watching the doll and the camera footage. In the morning, she reviewed the recording. To her horror, the doll had moved on its own. Its glassy eyes blinked, and its mouth opened and closed, whispering her name. Anya ran to her parents, showing them the footage. This time, they were concerned. Her father, Raj, decided to get rid of the doll. They drove to a remote spot and threw the doll into a deep, dark well. Relieved, they returned home, thinking the nightmare was over. But that night, Anya's relief turned to terror when she heard the whispers again. "Anya, I'm back." The doll was sitting on her bed, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight. Anya screamed and her parents rushed in. Seeing the doll, they knew something sinister was happening. They decided to seek help from an old friend of the family, Mrs. Sharma, who was known for her knowledge of the supernatural. Mrs. Sharma examined the doll and nodded grimly. "This doll is cursed," she said. "It is possessed by a vengeful spirit. We need to perform a ritual to banish it." The family gathered in the living room, with candles and a circle of salt around the doll. Mrs. Sharma began to chant in a language Anya didn't understand. The doll's eyes glowed red and it started to laugh, a high-pitched, maniacal sound. The whispers turned into screams. "Anya, you can't get rid of me," the doll shrieked. The room grew cold, and the lights flickered. Shadows danced on the walls, forming twisted shapes. Anya's heart pounded in her chest as she clung to her mother Priya. Mrs. Sharma's chanting grew louder, and the doll writhed within the circle of salt. The screams became unbearable, filling the room with a deafening noise. Just when it seemed the doll would break free, there was a blinding flash of light. The doll fell silent and still, its eyes dull and lifeless. "It's done," Mrs. Sharma said, her voice shaky. "The spirit is gone." Anya and her family were finally free from the doll's curse. They buried it deep in the woods, under a large, heavy stone. Life slowly returned to normal, but Anya would never forget the terror of those nights. Years later, when Anya had children of her own, she told them the story of the talking doll as a warning. And every so often, on a cold, dark night, she would imagine she could hear a faint whisper. "Anya,